Welcome to Conclave Maledictum, a grimdark gamers podcast on the Warhammer 40,000 tabletop role-playing game, Imperium Maledictum by Cubicle 7. I'm your host Jester, joined by my fellow co-host Gregor, and in this episode we're going to take a look at the first step in creating a campaign for Imperium Maledictum, creating your patron. Let's delve in. So, Gregor, what have you been up to hobby-wise then?
Well, recently I've still been fairly busy resetting up the apartment so that we can record more content, but that's now finished. However, I have managed to finish painting the Death Cult Assassin I've been working on, which is part of, I'm looking at it in the cupboard over there now, it's part of the Road Trader, what are they called? The Illusidian Starstriders kill team, which I absolutely want to get finished at some point because they look really fun to use. But I want to use that model for some Imperium Maledictum tutorial, so that I've got planned. For those of you who are watching on YouTube now, I'm going to stick up a spinning video of said model. But for those who aren't and are just listening to this audibly, rather than painting it green like they've done on the box art, which looks really nice, I've gone for the traditional red and blacks. Because that is the, well, assuming 40k is still 28mm, I mean, these days it's a bit bigger. But on 40k scale, that is, I believe, the third Death Cultist Assassin model they've made. The original two, which were in metal and then in Finecast, were based off the old Severine and Savora models from the Inquisitor game, which was my first taste of kind of 40k style role-playing. But other than that, no, not too much hobbying. I've now got the base I need so that I can actually mount the Forge World Trigon we've got. And the Forge World Trigon, which we've had
17 years.
17 years, yeah, that model can almost vote now. I'm finally going to actually get on with it. I'll probably do a little tutorial about that as part of getting ready for 10th, getting our Tyranids ready. So I'm going to work on that, and just looking over at the shelf, I think my Leviathan Dreadnought will be the next one I tackle as well for my Sons of Horus army.
All right, well, I'm really looking forward to seeing that Trigon. After all, we've had it for so long, it'll be great to actually see it with some paint on it. And I just love how, like, spiky it is and how sharp all of the edges are on it. I think it looks really cool. So I'm very excited to see that one, especially with all of the new 40k releases that we're getting.
Yeah, there's a lot of brand new Tyranid bugs coming out now. They all look really good, but, 17 years in our box set, it's time to paint them.
It's time to get done. Yeah, I mean, and for myself, I finished my World Eaters kill team, so very excited about using those. I know that probably not optimally designed for what you can do with the Legionaries kill team, but I love them. And they have possibly converted me to Khorne, so I'll probably end up collecting at least a small World Eaters army.
I was going to say, as a Legionaries player, it does kind of hurt my soul to not see a plasma gun equipped Legionary, but you have been very true to the law with that, which I do respect. But if we find, not having a plasma gunner or a balefire acolyte is holding you back, I think the Assault Intercessor rules are going to represent them just fine.
Absolutely. There's options for sure, but the models and the actual painting project were fantastic and I really enjoyed it. And my next projects are going to be completing my Blood Angel Blade Guard units that I've still got from the Indomitors box.
Mm-hmm.
And completing my Eradicators from that same box set as well. So I'm looking forward to getting those done, and then we'll see where we go from there and what my next project's going to be.
I was going to say, fantastic. Yeah, that's pretty much it for our hobby update. I mean, we're working on stuff for a lot of games. Imperium Maledictum, 40k, and Kill Team.
And Horus Heresy.
And Horus Heresy, so we're pretty busy on the hobby front.
There's a lot of stuff going on.
But I think that's probably enough for our hobby update. I do believe we've got some exciting news from Imperium Maledictum to share. So, shall we get to it?
Let's do it.
All right.
Yeah, so there's been some exciting new news from Cubicle 7. So they've confirmed that in addition to the cool rulebook that we'll be getting, there'll be a GM screen. We'll also be receiving a free PDF adventure and the new starter set as well. So there's going to be all of those released. So that's 4 things released pretty much immediately. And then additionally, we know that the way that they're going to be releasing additional content for Imperium Maledictum is going to be through faction expansion books. So the first faction that they're going to be working on is the Inquisition, and that book is largely complete. So we're not going to have a huge length of time where we're waiting for that to come out. Most of the work is already done. What I think is really interesting about the way they've chosen to release the faction expansion books is to do one which is focused for players and one which is focused for games masters. So that allows players to read the sections that they should be focusing on and not be worried about going into stuff that maybe the GMs don't want them to see.
That was always an issue I had with the expansion books for the previous games, like Dark Heresy 2nd Edition. Fantastic books, but it was equally weighted towards players and games masters, and there was just so many secrets that could get spoiled if the players read it. So,
and even if the players aren't trying to spoil it, they can stumble across something. So I think that's really cool. But what they're also doing is they're doing a combined slip book edition as well. So that's one where you get both of the books next to each other, but they're still separate editions. They've also confirmed, and this is pretty cool as well, they're going to be expanding further with a bestiary and an armory book as well.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that. I mean, bestiaries are always great because having different types of NPCs and creatures for your players to come across always just adds a lot more variety. And you can even add more variety by reskinning some of them and just having more profiles to work with is great. Never had a dedicated armory book before in the 40k RPG series. The expansions have always given us new gear to play with and, help expand our play options, which is awesome, but they've always kind of been spread out. So, curious to see how they do that. But I think the Inquisition book, I'm super excited for.
Yes.
Because obviously, that's going to allow me to run the exact kind of campaigns I'm most interested in. And after that, they haven't announced it yet, they just know that. They've just said that it will be coming along. The Rogue Trader expansion book. Because being able to go back with our old group and maybe return to our Rogue Trader game, but using a much newer system, would be really good.
That would be cool. Plus, as well, the adventures that you can have with Rogue Traders are really, really entertaining. And they're a bit different. They're kind of slightly more lighthearted, a bit more roguish than the grim darkness of the Inquisition.
Yeah, you can be completely true to the lore, but have a lot more fun with a Rogue Trader adventure. With the original Rogue Trader game, I would have described it as Star Trek meets Pirates of the Caribbean in Warhammer 40,000. So yeah, it's looking like an exciting release schedule coming up for Imperium Maledictum. Now, all of this news we got was from watching interviews by Padraig Murphy, who's appeared on some other channels with other content creators, and they've been asking him what's coming up for Imperium Maledictum, and apparently that's what he's been cleared to tell us so far. So that's quite the busy release schedule.
It is.
And I'm very much looking forward to seeing how the game develops.
Certainly.
So I think that probably wraps up the news for now. It's time to move on to today's topic, which is how do you start your adventure in Imperium Maledictum? What's the very first thing your group sits down to do? That is creating a patron. So creating your patron for your player characters is basically Imperium Maledictum's version of Session 0. Now, Session 0 itself is a huge topic, which we could spend an entire video talking about, but long story short, it's when the players set out their expectations for the campaign. And by creating your patron, you're going to be able to dictate exactly what it is that you as a player group want to play through. What type of campaign do you want to do? So that begs the question, what exactly is a patron? And long story short, it's your NPC quest giver. They are your character's boss. They will be providing you with the missions that you're going to be going on, but also providing you the resources you need to complete said missions. This is something that we've already seen in other games to a certain extent. In Dark Heresy 2nd Edition, before the group started playing, you would sit down together and create your Inquisitor. We have this in Imperium Maledictum, but where it's different is there's two key changes. The first change is your patron can belong to one of any of the 9 factions provided by the game, but also, and this bit is brand new and it's going to be very useful for games masters, is you mechanically set out the boons and limitations, the benefits and the drawbacks that your patron provides to your characters, which basically allows the GM to have a look at the patron as a character and go, okay, in this situation, what is it that a patron can actually do for the characters when the character calls upon them for help? Now, this can be done in a couple of different ways. The first way is really useful if the games master doesn't really know what kind of campaign they want to run. They just know they want to run Imperium Maledictum, and I've got some players agreeing that yes, they want to take part. And how that would work is all of them would sit down as a group and as a collaborative process, go through each step of the patron creation phases and say, hey, yeah, I want to do this. No, I don't want to do that. And by the end of it, you're going to have an idea of the type of campaign that the group wants to go through, and the games master can take that patron, go and write up the campaign, and then come back and start running it for the players. The other way, and I suspect we'll see this a lot, is when the GM, the games master, already has a really strong idea of the type of story that they want to run. And what they'll do is they'll create the basics of the patron beforehand and say, hey, I've got a really good idea for an inquisitorial investigation. This is the type of inquisitor I'm thinking of. Why don't you help me flesh out the details? And maybe the players can sit down and discuss the exact nature of the resources that the inquisitor can provide. And then the games master can go and merge that into the campaign and go from there. Now, this is really, really important because by the time you finish this process, you're going to know if you are going to be, say, running a game where you are working for the Imperial Navy, which would be completely different from, say, running a game where all the players are serving a crime boss in a hive. Imperium Maledictum can power lots of different types of experiences, and this is the stage where you dictate, this is the experience we want as a group. So, there's actually quite a few steps to this process, Jester. So why don't you talk to us about the very first thing? How do we begin this? What do we do when we go, okay, let's create a patron?
In Imperium Maledictum, your patron belongs to a particular faction. As you already mentioned, Gregor, there are 9 factions available within Imperium Maledictum. Those are the Astra Telepathica, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Adeptus Administratum, the Astra Militarum, the Adeptus Ministorum, Inquisition, Imperial Fleet, Rogue Trader Dynasties, and Infractionists. Whatever their true goals and motivations within that faction are, they still have day-to-day obligations. They still have a job to do within that faction. And that is what Imperium Maledictum deals with as part of their duty. So their duty is their job. And if you can't choose a duty, if you're just wanting to go ahead and roll everything up really quickly and randomly, then there is a table that does allow you to roll that randomly. But unlike in character creation, where if you kind of let the dice decide, you have some mechanical benefits to doing that, there are no mechanical benefits for leaving your patron up to chance.
Yeah, we're going to have a look at that later on in the character creation session, but there's no benefit to rolling things randomly. What is interesting, though, is that right now there's only 2 duties provided for each faction, which gives you, 18 possible patrons to choose from. And it's a good selection, but it's very obviously going to be an area that they expand on. For example, right now with the Inquisition, your patron, their duty choices can be, they can be a member of the Ordo Xenos, so they can be an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor, or they can be an Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus. The Ordo Malleus is very conspicuous in its absence, and I'm sure that's going to be fleshed out in the Inquisition book, which is coming out. But yeah, you're just deciding what it is your patron does. Who are you serving?
Absolutely. So then the next step is to look at how are they able to exploit that power that they hold within their faction. As I've already mentioned, they're a high-ranking member, and the way that Imperium Maledictum deals with this is that they have unique ways to access their power or their position within the faction. those are called boons.
So boons and liabilities, which are associated with said boons, are the mechanical impacts, both benefits and drawbacks, that the patron has on the player characters. Now, every patron by default has one free boon at the start of their process, but then the players can choose up to 3 extra boons for a total of 4 that the patron can provide them. The types of boons that your patrons can select are basically restricted to the faction and duty they have, because obviously different factions can provide different benefits as well as the roles within that faction, as well as the liabilities. Now, what's interesting is the players as a group can determine what boons that the patron has, but it's the games master who secretly decides what liabilities the patron has as well. And for every boon, there's going to be a matching liability. What's important to note is Cubicle 7 have clarified that the free boon that the patron comes with at the start absolutely also comes with a liability as well. There was some confusion. Some people thought there was no liability to the first boon, but no, there's always 1 boon plus 1 liability. You can choose up to 4 boons, but then you would have up to 4 liabilities as well. So it's really up to you to how complicated you want your patron to be. So Jester, let's have a look at a patron as an example. What did you choose for me?
I went with the Inquisitor from the Ordo Xenos.
Okay, that's an interesting choice because we've always usually had Hereticus Inquisitors. Our play group likes to burn things down.
We do, a lot.
But yeah, I've always been curious about an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor because the type of campaigns I've got in mind for them are quite varied, because you have very Puritan ones, like Eisenhorn was originally a member of the Ordo Xenos, but I think the Ordo Xenos type Inquisitor really fits nicely into the whole mad scientist vibe. So what did you go for?
So all Inquisitors, regardless of their duty, come with the free boon of limitless authority, and you've already touched on this. So technically, Inquisitors have no limit on what they can do. They technically can even order around Space Marines, although that might not be such a good idea, but theoretically they can do that.
Especially Space Wolves, they don't like it.
However, they may not want to do that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You can also have these additional boons, such as a fearsome reputation. And a fearsome reputation in the Ordo Xenos Inquisitor basically represents them having a name that people are scared of. They are associated with dastardly deeds or something like that. So when you mention their name to the right people, then they may be scared. They may want to do what you want them to do because they're worried about what the repercussions may be. Or it may have the opposite effect.
Okay. Yep, I see that.
The other one, and I think this one's pretty cool, is Xenotechnician. So this is basically where the Inquisitor is really, really interested in collecting alien artifacts, alien technology, which maybe the Imperium wouldn't approve of too much.
Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, each faction and duty, there's 10 boons that you can choose from. So you've gone for 3. So there was limitless authority, which you said that's the mandatory choice.
That's the mandatory free one.
Makes sense, being Inquisition. But they have fearsome reputation, and they're a Xenotechnician.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm just going to have a look at some liabilities there. So I would get to choose 3 liabilities as a result. Okay, so by the boons that you as my player have selected, that's already given me a really strong feeling as to the type of Inquisitor that you guys could be working for. So obviously I wouldn't mention this to the group, but if this was a real patron that you were creating, first thing I would choose would be your Inquisitor is going to demand discretion. Yes, they have limitless authority and will allow you to call upon their limitless authority when you absolutely have to. But if you do it too often, they're going to not only be unhappy, they'll probably punish the players. Why? Because secrecy is very much going to be a thing for this Inquisitor, even more so than normal. And I think because of that, the second thing I would choose would be they have unorthodox beliefs. So maybe they have done things which put them at odds with the rest of the Inquisition. And that could be lots of different things, right? So Ordo Xenos Inquisitor, I mean, when you think of an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor, the first image I come up with is alien bodyguard. Maybe they have like a Kroot bodyguard, that's quite normal. Or maybe they're an Inquisitor with lots of enemies, so they want some of the galaxy's best assassins, and they have, I don't know, like a Drukhari warrior.
Ooh.
Yeah, or a member of the Witch cult, or something like that, which would definitely raise a lot of eyebrows. I mean, that's if I was going for a more like serious type radical. If I was going for a slightly more comical radical, I mean, the unorthodox beliefs could be like maybe the Inquisitor wants to experiment on the player characters with like unethical surgeries, like replace your hands with like rippers or something. But regardless, I'm thinking something where he believes what he's doing is the best for the Imperium, but yeah, his methods would put him at odds. So that means the final liability I would choose that makes sense here looking at the page, Nemesis.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind now, okay, here's a complication I'm going to introduce to the campaign. Because of his unorthodox beliefs, he's actually run afoul of a particularly puritanical, monodominant witch hunter. And maybe at some point, that witch hunter and their retinue tracks down you players. And now not only are you fighting enemies of the Imperium, you're going to be fighting loyal members of the Imperium. The reason I would do that is interfraction, so like Inquisitor combat. It's one of my favorite things about the whole Inquisition thing.
I take offense that you're suggesting that we would not be loyal members of the Imperium.
Well, I mean, you'll be super loyal once you're burnt at the stake, according to the Ordo Hereticus. But no, there you go. That is how, as a games master, the players have instantly provided me with some inspiration by telling me these are the kind of boons we want from our Inquisitor, and that already gave me instant insight into the type of character their Inquisitor was, making it super easy to choose the right liabilities to make the campaign interesting. Okay, so we have discussed boons, we've discussed liabilities, and those are very much the mechanical effects of the patron set in stone. So now it's time to start looking at the more roleplay aspects of it, and look at the next section, which is deciding your Inquisitors, well, your patrons' motivation.
Your patrons' motivations are not just what their goals and what they're trying to achieve. It's broader than that in Imperium Maledictum. It's actually their worldview. It's where they see themselves within the galaxy. So the game provides some examples, and it gives 5 examples of motivations. So the first of which is conflict. This is basically where your patron is trying to achieve their ends through violence. It can be direct violence, going out and killing someone, or it can be indirect violence. So sowing seeds of distrust between 2 rival gangs and waiting for that to explode into violence.
I mean, I think this is the one that probably fits the easiest amongst most of, well, no, all of the faction types. I mean, I can think of so many different examples. I mean, it can be something as simple as aforementioned Inquisitors sending out their acolytes to burn out a cult, or it could be the Astra Militarum sending out an elite squad. Maybe there's 2 large alien empires fighting against each other, and think of like an Only War style campaign here, and you need to, like, say, secretly lend aid to the weaker faction so it does more damage against the bigger alien faction so that they both weaken themselves quite substantially.
Absolutely.
Could be competing rogue trader houses as well.
That could also be really cool.
Yep, I mean, conflict in 40k, I mean, it's just, right, it's the meat and potatoes of the setting.
It's every day.
Yeah, so what's the next one?
The next one is information. So this is where your patron's really interested in gathering data, gathering maybe forbidden lore, maybe trying to get hold of tech that they wouldn't normally have access to.
Okay, so like an Inquisitor getting their acolytes to infiltrate a cult, or I can see this being really cool. A Mechanicus tech pre sending out their team to chase up leads on maybe a secret STC that's been uncovered, or maybe, if they're slightly more radical, a vault of alien tech.
Absolutely, yeah.
I want to see an adventure set inside a Blackstone Fortress. That would be really cool. I mean, the Blackstone Fortress game is excellent. I'd like to be able to explore that bit more within a role-playing game. All right, nice. So that's number 2. What's the third one?
The third one is reputation. So what really motivates your patron is basically building a name for themselves, gaining respect, building status. So this might be where players are sent out to conduct acts of heroism in the name of the patron.
Okay, so that could fit, for example, like a rogue trader or mercantile thing. For me, the classic example I'm thinking of is the corrupt, well, not fully corrupt, but maybe overly ambitious, like Archbishop of the Ministorum or something, trying to improve their station. Okay, very nice. What else do we have?
Material. So this is one where your patron is interested in basically getting hold of stuff. So they are sending you out to collect equipment that's headed to a rival or something along those lines. So it's actually getting hold of physical items.
So, okay, I know the obvious example here is going to be Rogue Trader, the acquisition of profit and wealth. But Astra Militarum, how would you make an adventure about that? A regiment that does not see enough love in the law is the Savlar Chem Dogs, and they're well known for when they are serving in a theatre, for going on missions to steal stuff from other regiments for them to use instead.
Yes.
So that could be. I mean, I don't know how many. I don't know what the legs would be like on a campaign like that, but for a few shorter adventures, I think that would be quite fun. Or it could just be, a Necromunda style campaign where you are part of a gang trying to get bigger. That could be reputation, or it could just be you doing it for money. All right, nice. So, final one?
Yeah, this one's actually quite unusual. This is where your patron is motivated by unity. So what they're trying to do is actually stop the seeds of distrust. They're trying to bring factions together. They think that the way that the Imperium is going to succeed is by improving the bonds of friendship between different factions.
I mean, that seems very, very noble. Maybe a little bit naive within the setting, but okay, that's for a very hopeful style campaign.
Absolutely.
And then crush your players' hopes and dreams.
Immediately.
No, what's interesting about these different motivations is you can create one for yourself, obviously, as Games Master. But if you're really not sure, you can roll for it. I was looking at the table, and every single faction can end up with any one of those 5 motivations. Yeah. The rolls are weighted, so certain factions are more likely to roll a given motivation. Like, for example, the Inquisition has a higher chance of getting the information-based motivation. So what can happen is you can actually end up with some odd combinations, such as a material-obsessed Inquisitor. Now, you could just re-roll for that if you just can't think of any reason why that combination of motivation and faction duty would work. Or you could use that as a role-playing opportunity and go, no, that's what we got, let's stick with it. Let's explore the narrative reasons why our patron is the way they are. Why do they have that motivation? Why do they have that worldview? Why do they have that goal? Which could be quite interesting for a lot of groups. But yeah, there you go. Motivation. So with the motivation set, I believe we then go on to the next stage.
So, as you say, now we know what their motivations are, we understand what their view of the galaxy is. We don't yet know much about their personality traits, so what they're like as an individual.
Okay, so let's discuss their demeanor.
Absolutely.
So at this point of the patron creation process, you're actually almost done. So I'm going to roll the next 2 steps together, which is demeanor and payment. So the demeanor is exactly as it sounds. It is what is your patron's personality like. So if the Games Master doesn't already have a strong idea of how the patron would conduct themselves, they can just choose a demeanor from the table. They've given 5 example demeanors and you can roll for them. And there's no mechanical effect to this. It's really just guidance to inform the GM how they should portray them, how they should act when they are speaking as the patron. So the first one is wrathful. Do you have a particularly angry, wrathful patron? That means they would be quick to act. They're not going to be very indecisive. They're going to be very, very decisive, but they might rush into things. That could be their downsides. But it also means that they would be very demanding of results and probably not very tolerant of excuses for failure. I'm thinking of like Auto Hereticus Inquisitor or Astra Militar in general would fit that bill. The opposite of that would be if they had a more somber style patron where they are much slower to act, they are much more thoughtful about their actions. But the flip side of that is they might be demanding perfection from their acolytes, the player characters, and expect them to come up with cunning plans and not just rush into things. You could also have a patron who is, I'm just looking at the table here, pragmatic. Now, this is what I call the reasonable demeanor, which is probably not very common in 40k, but this is the kind of patron who accepts, much more so than other characters within the universe, that sometimes the best way to get things done is to be willing to compromise, which isn't very Imperial, I feel. You could end up with quite the zealous patron, very loyal, but they are going to be very active and enthusiastic. They're going to surround themselves with allies, and they are going to hate idleness. They're going to want to get things done, be really active in their approach, send people out on missions. But the flip side to that is they're also the kind of character type that could behave too rashly, act too quickly, and end up in trouble by doing so. And finally, the final type that they've provided is the inscrutable demeanor, which is where you can't tell what your patrons really, really like because they're always talking to their underlings, the player characters, through a veneer of professionalism. They're the clear-cut professional, which sometimes means it can be quite hard to gauge exactly what the patron is about, which would be really tough if you have a patron who isn't exactly who they say they are. All right. So that's personalities. It's something you could just choose for, make up on the spot. You don't have to go for those 5. But the next thing that you have to decide in this process is the payments level. How much is your patron going to be paying your characters to complete their work? Now, payment happens every few days. That isn't defined, but broadly speaking, it is in between missions, your characters will get their payment stipends. If an adventure is particularly long, the GM can probably decide it happens in between them. But there are 4 different grades. There's like poor, where you get 50 solars. Standard, which is where you start, where you get 100. Then 200, and finally the excellent rating, where that triples to 600.
Wow.
So that's going to be quite a lot. I don't actually know if that is a lot within the setting. I imagine it is. It's called excellent. But what's interesting to note is whilst you start off at the standard level of 100 solars, which is the name of the currency, more on that in a second, it can actually go up or down at the start of the campaign, depending on boons and liabilities. Once the campaign is started, your payment grade is going to completely depend on whether you impress or disappoint your patron. Now, what's really important to note, this combined with your patron's demeanor, it's really important that you do this with fun in mind. This is not a game about disappointing your boss. If it feels that way, you're probably doing it wrong at that point, and you kind of need to stop and reassess where you're going wrong with that, because we use these games as escapism from real life work. We don't want the game to be representative of that. The other points I want to talk about with payments is, and these are very minor, solars are the currency instead of throne gelt, which is what it was traditionally known as, probably because it's set within the Macarius sector from Lord Solar Macarius. But also, this is the first game since the very first edition of Dark Heresy, which was the first of the D140k RPG games to return to using hard currency. From Rogue Trader through to Dark Heresy 2nd edition, they went to a more abstract system, which was called Influence. But now, no, you actually track down how much you're spending, how much you've got as cold hard cash. Now, influence does exist still within Imperium Maledictum, but it's completely different. And I think that's the final thing we need to talk about, right, with our patrons.
Certainly is.
So, Jester, tell us about influence.
Your patron's influence is how they're perceived or recognized within their own faction and also by the other factions in the setting. And this can be both positive and negative. So, for example, say your patron has positive influence with the Ministorum. That might be because they're known for being extremely pious. But they may have negative influence with the Ministorum because perhaps they said something negative once about the Imperial Creed.
Which will be pretty dangerous within the Imperium. But the influence system is actually really quite deep, and we're going to probably do an episode on it because it's going to be one of the primary driving engines for social encounters. What is important to note at this stage is that the relationships your character has with the different factions is obviously going to be useful for opening doors, but can also close doors. This also applies to name dropping your patron. Sometimes when you find doors closed and people are just refusing to deal with you, name dropping your patron might open up those doors when they realize, oh, you're working for that person. Well, okay, don't want to anger them, and they'll work alongside the characters. But if you happen to be dealing with a faction who knows your patron and doesn't think favorably of them, that's going to be closing doors, not opening them. This really is quite deep. We will cover this later on, but really the only thing that is worth mentioning at this point and how the patrons tie into the influence system. So when you call upon those boons and also when those liabilities trigger that we're talking about earlier, that can actually influence your patrons' influence with their factions, I guess. So it's not a static figure. Just as your character is going to be improving their relationships and therefore their influence with certain factions and certain members of their factions and worsening it with others, the same thing's going to be happening to your patron as different boons and liabilities trigger, as well as the narrative beats of the story as well. So that's about it for creating your patron. The last thing to do is the hardest part, creating the name. Always is.
Always.
It's like when you stare at a character creation screen in a video game for ages because you finished it long ago, but it's like, what do I name them? But other than that, you are done. With the patron created, if the Games Master doesn't have a story, they can start going away and writing up the framework of their campaign. But the next step, which we'll be looking at next episode, is going to be character creation, where the player characters actually create their avatars or the character that they're representing within the game themselves. So that's about it. Do you have any final thoughts or anything like that regarding the patron system? It seems pretty straightforward and logical to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the number of factions that are available. I think it's going to give a lot of opportunities for different styles of games and role-playing that maybe we wouldn't have had before.
Yeah, I think the one that surprised everyone, and certainly surprised me, was being able to choose a patron from the Adeptus Administratum. Having a tax collector of sorts is an interesting choice for a role-playing game, but no, I can see how that would actually be a lot of fun within the universe of Warhammer 40,000 and the type of adventures that can be told. So that brings us to the end of this episode, and we hope you found it useful. In the next episode, we're going to take a look at the next step, which is often the part people really enjoy, character creation. If you have any questions you'd like us to answer in an upcoming episode, email us at conclavemaledictum@outlook.com. If you want to support the show, subscribe to us or follow us on your podcast service of choice, or if you really like what we do here, consider buying us a beer and check out our Patreon, where you'll get access to a number of perks and benefits, such as access to our Discord server, early access to some of our videos on YouTube, and the occasional behind-the-scenes videos for people who support us at the Interrogator and above levels. We'll see you all next time.